Hamilton and Leclerc were disqualified from the US Grand Prix after their car's planks had been worn beyond the legal limit. The plank on the bottom of an F1 car is used to protect the underside, to stop shards of carbon fiber rubbing along the track, and by regulations they're required to be 10mm thick, and the wear, which is measured after the race at different points on the plank, cannot be more than 1mm. The FIA released scrutineering documents, which they do after every race, which basically outlines all of the different checks that they do on all of the cars to make sure that after a race they're all legal and comply with the technical regulations. 4 cars were selected to have their planks measured, saying a physical floor and plank wear inspection was carried out on car numbers 1, 16, 44 and 4. Now, the FIA selects random cars to check due to time constraints because these cars have to fly out to Mexico in just a few days' time, and after the race there isn't enough time for them to check and measure every single component on every single car for legality, so they choose different cars for different components. Unfortunately, at the end of the document, the FIA technical delegate Joe Bauer informed the stewards that, apart from the rear skids of car numbers 16 and 44, all car weights and the items checked were found to be in conformity with the 2023 FIA Formula 1 technical regulations. This matter was then sent to the stewards, but much like when in Hungary in 2021 when Sebastian Vettel was also disqualified from the podium for not having a sufficient enough amount of fuel in his fuel sample, technical breaches are basically black and white, and so both Leclerc and Hamilton were disqualified from the race. The 2 biggest reasons for why this happened was the sprint format of the weekend and then also the bumpy nature of the track. All weekend long, the bumps and how the cars will cope with them was a big talking point, and even though the track has recently been resurfaced, the geology of the soil underneath the track means that the ground moves a lot when the temperature gets either very hot or when it's really wet. Because it was a sprint weekend with only 1 practice session before the cars and their setups were locked for the rest of the weekend in Parc Ferme, the teams have very little time to dial in their cars and pick a ride height that gets them the maximum amount of performance, but is also safe enough to not wear out the plank. Fundamentally, the teams just didn't have enough time in FP1 to do a long enough stint length that's representative and can actually give them an indication of whether to lower or raise their car. Keep in mind, during FP1, some teams are bringing upgrades, and so you need to do a few test laps to see how they're correlating to the simulations that you did. You've also got to test all of the 3 tyre compounds so that the drivers get a sense for how they feel, and then you also have to try and do both low and high fuel runs on each of the tyres to get a sense for tyre wear for the race. Needless to say, that is a lot of work, and so that's the difficulty in trying to set your car up and trying to predict what your pace and tyre wear will be like on a fuel load that you've never driven on before for a race that's happening in 2 days' time. Of course, the rules are the same for every team, so it's not an excuse for Mercedes and Ferrari, but keep in mind, the FIA only decided to check the planks of 4 out of the 20 cars, and considering that 50% failed the test, I am willing to go out on a limb and say that Mercedes and Ferrari probably weren't the only ones to get it wrong, they were just the only ones to get caught. In the end, technical infringements like this are pretty cut and dry, there's not really too much to discuss. There's definitely lessons to be learned from it, perhaps the teams maybe will be more cautious in the future, but whilst I can't discount that Leclerc and Hamilton might have had a slight performance advantage because of it, I don't know how much lap time it might have been worth, and so to me, it doesn't take away from Leclerc's stunning qualifying laps on Friday and Saturday, and it doesn't take away from what, in my opinion, was probably Lewis's best race of the season. That is why to me, I think it's still important to look back on this race at face value, because this was one of the very, very few races this season where someone other than Red Bull genuinely could have won. The biggest reason for this, to be honest, was that the field this weekend was kind of helped by the fact that Red Bull was slightly pegged back. Firstly, Max was nursing a brake issue during the race, and secondly, Red Bull's only weakness this season has been bumpy tracks because their biggest performance advantage over the rest of the grid is in how much downforce they generate using their floor, and so when they have to raise the ride height, it seems to disproportionately affect them more. Therefore, before McLaren and Mercedes get too excited that they're a 10th away from being championship contenders, I think this weekend we saw the RB19 at about 90%, And so I'm sure when we get to Mexico, which is a track that Max absolutely owns, I think the grid is going to get a very rude awakening. Having said that, Red Bull having just 90% of the RB19 did open the door of opportunity for the upper midfield. Despite Lando's exceptional qualifying, which allowed him to lead the race for a decent number of laps, I don't think McLaren ever really quite had the race pace to really challenge. I think Lando and the team did everything that they could. They were aggressive and decisive with their strategy, pitting early and forcing everyone else to react. And the fact that P3, which turned into a P2, can be considered as a disappointing day is more of a sign of how much McLaren has improved this season. Mercedes, on the other hand, definitely did have the pace and the driver to win. Lewis Hamilton has always excelled around Austin. Before this weekend, he had never finished lower than 4th. He won here when he was at McLaren. During the early hybrid era, he won here 4 years in a row, and he also finished on the podium here last year in the W13. Unfortunately, whilst they had the car and the driver, the operational side of the team I think really let them down. And not only is this not the first time this season, I think it reflects a wider gap in quality compared to Red Bull. It seemed like Mercedes, similar to Zandvoort, got caught in two different strategies, between reacting to Norris and Verstappen, who seemed to commit to doing 2 stops, and potentially trying to do what Leclerc ended up doing with a 1 stop. After the opening laps, Lewis was in 4th place, over 4 seconds behind Lando, but by lap 17 he worked his way through to 2nd, and at the point Lando pitted, managed to close that down to just 1.4 seconds, showing incredible pace. When Lando came out and with Lewis on old tyres, Lando started to demolish that gap. At times he was 2 seconds a lap faster, and Mercedes knew that they were in trouble. Better late than never, Mercedes pitted Lewis 3 laps later, but the gap to Lando, which was just 1.4 seconds, was now almost 9, and Lewis was also now behind Max as well. During the next round of pit stops, once Max had overtaken Lando for the lead, Lewis had closed the gap to just 6 seconds. This time Mercedes did the only thing that they could and ran a little bit longer to put Lewis on a quicker tyre for the final stint. But when he came out, the gap the team left him to close and overtake everyone for the win was now over 7.5 seconds to Max. In 18 laps, Lewis closed the gap to Max from 7.5 to just under 2 seconds on the final lap, when Max really started to struggle with his brakes and tyres. In the end, he ran out of laps, and even in the moment it felt like, even though the pace was there, the team cost him the win. The indecision over the first stop was what really cost Lewis, because to go from 1.4 seconds behind Lando to 9 seconds in exchange for having 3 lap newer tyres, that was a trade-off that was just too much to overcome. DHL and Pirelli keep track of pit stop data every single season, handing out points to the teams in an F1 style championship. In 2022, over the course of the whole season, Mercedes ranked just 8th fastest, only ahead of Haas and Alfa Romeo, with Red Bull and McLaren 1st and 2nd. This year in the standings, so far Mercedes are still only 7th fastest, whilst at the front, Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren occupy the top 3 places. In the race, when it mattered most for a Grand Prix win, whilst Russell got pit stops of 2.8 and 2.5 seconds, Hamilton got pit stops of 3.6 and 3.4 seconds. Bearing in mind, last time out in Qatar, McLaren did a record-breaking 1.8 second pit stop. In Formula 1, anything over 3 seconds is considered bad, and Mercedes gave Hamilton 2 bad pit stops. If Mercedes gave Hamilton Russell's pit stops, he would have shaved 1.7 seconds off his race time at the end. Considering Lewis finished under 2 seconds behind Max, that time is not even that difficult to find, and that's not even mentioning the biggest mistake, which was the indecision over a 1 or 2 stop in the first stint. Even Max after the race said that Mercedes could have won with a better strategy, and yes, although it's all academic given that Lewis got disqualified, how and why Mercedes lost the race is still important. The reason why Red Bull are so dominant is not just because of the car, and it's not just because of Max. It's because as a team, from top to bottom, they have the best in class in the 3 most important areas: the driver, the car, and the team. In F1, you need all 3 elements to win, and you need to have the best on the grid in all three elements to dominate. For Mercedes, this race will represent a big learning curve, not just with what happened with the disqualification, but that on an operational level, there is still a very clear gap between the two teams. During a season like this, where a marginal win against a dominant team is possible, but only if you get every aspect of race execution right, Mercedes' shortcomings stood out more than ever. Whether they'll get a better chance than Austin to fight for a win remains to be seen. But the one thing that is certain is that they definitely fumbled their best chance of the season so far. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to like and subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.